Hospital about a week longer than originally planned. He had a partially collapsed left lung from the surgery, but he's doing well. He came home Thursday night, and I came home yesterday afternoon. Mom's actually able to go to worship today and leave him by himself for about an hour or so. But he's doing well and recovering, and I appreciate you guys checking in. I really appreciate the elders letting me go and do some things that needed to be done and help Mom and Dad out. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. I've got some things here. You know, we've got that little table in the back of in the foyer back there. When Gail's brother was here the other day, he showed me some stuff that I had never seen before in terms of evangelism, and so I ordered some things. I guess these are about 3x5 little cards. One of these cards is, and some of you I know have seen this video, called Where Do We Go When We Die? And then on the back of it, it has a bunch of biblical topics, biblical passages on that topic. And then for those of you who do QR codes, any of you in here do QR codes? Okay, there's one. I don't know, I don't do them either. You scan it with your phone, and it'll open a website on your phone that'll take you to a video about this. So anyway, I ordered a couple of these, a couple of different cards. Again, one is Where Do You Go When You Die? And the other one is about the gospel being reenacted. So we've got 250 of these cards each. Take some with you. Hand them out to folks. I've got them up here. I'll put them on that table back there and use them. All right, so we started this study for the month of December on the New Testament and finances. We've looked at all these terms. We're not going to go over all that again. Proverbs on finances, and then we defined some of the more, I guess you'd say, difficult terms that we're not familiar with. Last Sunday, we talked about two passages from Luke. Luke 12, the man who wanted the bigger barns, and then Luke chapter 16 and the principle of stewardship. If you can't be trusted with the mammon of unrighteousness, how can you be trusted with the true riches? So the New Testament, and Jesus himself talks a lot about money and his disciples' use of money. So what I thought we would talk about today is contribution, the New Testament on the contribution. Then next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll get back together and study on a more specific question that was asked in our young adult class about our personal use of our finances, investments, savings, and things like this. But kind of just building some groundwork on things that I guess you'd say we may be more familiar with, looking into something that perhaps we haven't looked at enough in connection with the use of our money. You know, God, one of the things that a Christian is a steward. We've been entrusted with a lot of things, and our finances would be one of those things. So 1 Corinthians 16, somebody read the first 4 verses, please. Okay, so usually when we reference this passage, we use the first 2 verses here in regard to the every Sunday contribution to the church. So I want us to lay this text out and deal with it accurately. First of all, you notice that this collection was for the saints. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, and the preposition there is interesting because it's a preposition that points somewhere else. The money that you're gathering today, you might say it this way, is going to a different location. Okay? For the saints in Jerusalem. So we need to look at a couple verses. Why was the church in Corinth putting money together for the church in Jerusalem? So let's go to Acts chapter 11, get some background on why exactly this was taking place. This, by the way, this contribution here that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16 is mentioned in at least 3 other passages in the New Testament. So we're going to look at all those and see exactly what we're dealing with here. Acts 11, somebody read 27 through 30, please. Okay, so time frame. Claudius Caesar reigned from 41 to 54. So that tells me then that the book of 1 Corinthians was written sometime before AD 54 because they're still working on this collection. But again, you notice here the stated purpose of this is, again, poor saints in Jerusalem, the needy brethren in Jerusalem, or Judea specifically, but Jerusalem is in Judea. And it's interesting because, of course, Luke, when he's writing the book of Acts, he's looking back, writing by inspiration, talking about this event, and mentions that this individual by the name of Agabus prophesied or showed by the Spirit that there would be a great famine or a great dearth that would take place. So, when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 16, there's a passage you can connect with that shows you exactly what's going on. That's why this collection in Corinth is for the saints in Jerusalem. They knew this was coming. The disciples knew this was coming because of that prophecy by Agabus. Let's go to Romans chapter 15. This is another place where this contribution, if you want to use that term, is mentioned. And I have verse 26, but let me look at this for a second. Somebody read Romans 15, 25 through 28, please. Romans 15, 25 through 28. Okay, hold on just a second. Achaia, that's where Corinth is. Achaia is a region. Corinth was a city there. And again, it's for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. All right, go ahead. Okay, now you notice that statement there in verse 27. The Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things. Well, the there in verse 27 is a reference to the Jews. And the spiritual things obviously is the gospel. The gospel went to the Gentiles by the hand of the Jews, right? Peter, 6 other Jews went to the household of Cornelius. That's how the gospel went to the Gentiles. Well, so if it's the case that the Gentiles have benefited from the spiritual, from the teachings of the new covenant, it is their duty, the Gentiles' duty, to minister to the Jews in physical things or material things. So, when it comes to contribution, there's fellowship. One of the words that's used, for instance, is in Philippians chapter 4, where Paul talks about, I think the King James uses the word communication. The New King James uses the word sharing. No one communicated with me at the gospel except for you. That's the word to share, to participate in. And it's talking about a financial contribution. So, they benefited spiritually. You need to help them out physically in this need. And then, so here we go. So, back to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. The command then was for the Gentile churches in Galatia. So if you're back in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and you'll notice this uniformity of teaching here, or the uniformity of the command, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, so do ye also. Corinth, Achaia, you do the same thing that the churches in Galatia did. Macedonia, Achaia, to contribute to the needs of the Jewish congregations in Judea. When we talk about fellowship, okay, it's more than just what goes on inside a church building. It can include, obviously, financial contributions, multiple congregations pooling their funds together to help others, to help other congregations. Again, you go back up to the first bullet point there. The collection was for the saints in Jerusalem. There are those, even within churches of Christ, that say, well, the churches of Christ, each congregation is autonomous, and therefore you cannot pool your funds together congregationally to help somebody else. That's just not right. You have commands, like 1 Corinthians chapter 16, you do exactly what I told Galatia to do, but then you also have examples of it being done, as recorded there in Romans chapter 15. It was already in the process of being done. Any questions or comments on any of that? Okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2, when was this collection to take place? On the first, you will notice, if you look at a King James and a New King James, the word day is italicized. It's the first of the week. Well, and in fact, and this is kind of like Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. The disciples came together upon the first of the week. The way the Greek phrases it, it's the first of every week. So we have this model, you might say, this example laid out for us of taking up a contribution on the first of the week. But notice here that there be no gatherings, King James, collections when I come. Paul wants this. If you've been in the Lord's church any period of time, you've seen, I'll just use the word programs, started, efforts started, and in time they just, what happens? Kind of fizzles, gets a little disorganized, fewer and fewer people get involved. That's exactly what happens here. So if we think we've discovered some new way to handle programs, you're wrong. Corinth did it the same way. And we'll talk about that more in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 here in just a minute. But this has been going on for some period of time and to multiple congregations in different regions of that area. Okay, anything else on 1 Corinthians chapter 16? All right, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. This is kind of a little bit of jumping ahead, but somebody read 2 Corinthians 9 and verses 1 and 2. Because this is 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 are talking about the same contribution of 1 Corinthians 16 and the same contribution of Romans chapter 15. So somebody read those two verses, please. Okay, so Paul's talking to other congregations about, as he says here, Achaia, which is Corinth. That's who he's talking about there. Boasting to those in Macedonia of what you in Corinth were doing, but notice how long ago? About a year. So again, this 1 Corinthians 16, you need to do this. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, you were willing to do it a year ago. So we have about a year's space between 1 and 2 Corinthians. And the program has kind of fizzled. You guys need to get your act together. Essentially is what Paul's saying there in 2 Corinthians 9. Notice in chapter 9 here, verse 1, for as touching the ministering to the saints. That word minister is a form of the word deacon. Your service to, your coming to the aid of. When we hear this word deacon, oftentimes we think of a role in the church, deacons, 1 Timothy chapter 3. But the word, this Greek term is used, I don't know how many times in the New Testament. It's used, for instance, of Jesus. He came not to minister, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. That's the same word. Now there was another one I had in mind. Oh, Romans chapter 13. Government officials, they are God's ministers, deacons, the ones who attend to this business. So This is the term used here in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 1, for as touching the service toward or the coming to the aid of the saints. And again, that's 1 Corinthians 16:1. Now concerning the collection for the saints. All right? So now I want us to look at 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 because this is kind of an interesting discussion. So we might as well have it because we're here. What are our funds that we collect on the first day of each week? What are they used for? Okay. Yes. I want some specificity, though. She said everything the church, how did you say it? Everything the church needs to. Okay. Yes. What did you say? Okay. Paying the bills. All right. Okay, missionaries overseas. Missionaries overseas. Okay? What else? Youth? Oh, you, yeah, preacher. Fulton County Gospel News.
Supporting students in preacher training schools.
Okay, preacher training schools. I met, by the way, I was in Memphis the other day, and I got a call from the school to speak on the lectureship in March, and I went over there, and I got to meet Zach Lockhart, who we are supporting, who's from Curry Street. So that was kind of neat. Youth events, the children's home. So our money goes to a lot of different places. And that's one of the things that, the New Testament talks about a variety of ways money is used. I mean, we're talking about it now. But it doesn't just talk about how the money that the church collects is used. It talks about how the church collects the money and the manner in which each particular individual gives. So that's kind of 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. But it's in the context of 1 Corinthians 16 and this collection for the saints. Okay, so you guys were willing, chapter 9, verse 2, a year ago to do this. Now you need to get to doing it because I've been boasting to these churches in Macedonia about how good Achaia has been about this. So, how do you give? That's the question. Because personally, we've got a mortgage, we've got a vehicle payment, we've got health insurance. If you're raising kids, you've got kids. Maybe you want to stick a little back. You want to have a savings account for yourself. You got to buy groceries. If I've got some left on Sunday, I'll put a little in the basket. Is that how it really works? Well, I would say, probably in some cases, yes. Is that how it's supposed to work? Is the question. And the answer to that is no. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, somebody read verse 5. Okay, so that's why I call this the key to abundant giving. You have saints in Jerusalem. This is prophesied about. There's a famine coming. They are in need. They're starving. And so these other churches in these other areas had first given themselves to the Lord. When it comes to our financial contributions to the church, if we as individuals are not dedicated to God as individuals, I am Romans 12, a living sacrifice. If I am not dedicated to God properly in my mind and with my actions, then my giving is not going to be what it ought to be. But if I've first given myself to the Lord and I understand, okay, He's number one in life, then I'm going to probably shift some things around so that my giving reflects such. Now, I guess I would also say, our country particularly is eaten up with the health and wealth gospel. You send us your money to this particular ministry, and God, He'll bless you. You'll get the job promotion you want. Life's going to just be the way you want it to be if you give us the money that we're asking for. And people like Joel Osteen, that's the message that they preach, and they fare pretty well, don't they? But these first 5 verses here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 talks about this, about the contribution. And some, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 2. Some of these people that were contributing to the poor saints in Judea were giving out of their own what? According to that verse. Their deep poverty. So, and when I read that, that kind of makes me think of the widow's mites in Mark chapter 12. She's in the company of all these wealthy people who are putting in a bunch of money, but she, out of her poverty, gave all that she had. Now, that does not mean that we forsake all of our financial responsibilities to put a bigger check in and don't take care of our families and pay our bills. It doesn't mean that. The spirit of giving is just that. It's the spirit, the mindset that's behind it. Not grudgingly. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that because, again, the New Testament lays this out here. Again, this has been taking place for at least a year. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 10. And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient for you, who have begun before not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now, therefore, perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, okay, so a year ago, you guys were excited about this. Hey, this is something we can get involved with. So there may be a performance. Okay, having a will to do something, that's good. But if you don't perform, what's the will? Well, it's just that. It's kind of like a wish. Verse 12, for if there be first a willing mind. Okay, so they've given themselves to the Lord first, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5. Now, how do you perform that? Well, you have to have a willing mind. And then when you have a willing mind to contribute, it is accepted according to what a man has and not according to what he does not have. Would you say, okay, so looking around our auditorium, I would say every single one of us is in a different financial situation. Every one of us. Some are retired, some are working, some are raising kids, some are single. I mean, we're all different. But the principle of giving, or the method of giving, let's say, is based on what's said there in verse 12. A willing mind, and it's based on what you have. You can't, in other words, you can't compare what you give to the Lord to what somebody else gives, because they have a completely different situation. So we have to be careful about that. It's not a competition, but you've got to have a willing mind. Thirdly, so this is another principle of New Testament giving. In fact, I heard somebody last night, we were up at the school at the tournament, I heard somebody say something about their tithe check. Well, the New Testament method of giving is always free will. There is no New Testament tithing. Now, the word is used, but I want to look at a couple things first. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 3 and 12. Somebody read those 2 verses. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's no baseline contribution amount. There's no 10% principle in the New Testament. It's just not there. And then chapter 9, notice beginning in verse 6. And this is what Ms. Sharon said a minute ago. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully, every man according as he purposeth. What does it mean to purpose in your heart? This is an intentional consideration. I have planned out what I will give. So let him give, not grudgingly, okay? Not grudgingly, not out of pain. Okay, the basket, oh man, it's coming down my aisle. I hate doing this. If that's how you give, keep your money. Because you have a problem. Or out of necessity, obligation, or duty. One of the things that's interesting, let me see if I have it on here. Yeah, so the last bullet point here. Throughout this discussion of this particular contribution, it's called a grace, it's called a ministering, it's called a gift, And if you are grudging and you're giving simply out of duty, keep your money. Why? What does the rest of the verse say? Because God loves a cheerful giver, a willing mind and cheerful. It's kind of interesting because the word for cheerful in the Greek, it's hilarious. And that's almost how it's pronounced. Hilarios. It's out of a heart of joy. And it's like, this is something I get to do. It's not dreading the first day of the week because I sit around people and they watch. You know, they're going to see, and I'll just roll it up so nobody will see. We have all these thoughts that go in through our minds, and, our minds should be, God loves a cheerful giver. And what is expected of me, going back to chapter 8 and verse 12, is not what you do not have, not what you're not able to do, but based on what you do have and what you are able and willing to do in your contribution. So, so the tithe, let's talk about that for a minute. The word tithe is found a couple of times in the New Testament, twice used by Jesus in connection with what the Pharisees would give under the law of Moses. They would tithe of mint and anise and cumin, these different spices. They would count out a tenth. If they had a pound of cumin, they would count out 1/10 and give that precisely. There's nothing wrong with that. And then in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 2 through 9, it's talking about when Abraham met Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. So my point is this. The only time tithing is mentioned in the New Testament is in connection with the contribution of the Pharisees under the law of Moses and what Abraham gave to Melchizedek. New Testament giving is not tithing. You don't sit down and figure out your 10%. It's a free will offering. I've heard preachers say, 10% is the baseline. Show me in Scripture where that says that. You're not going to, because it's not there. It's based on not what you do not have, but what you do have, and out of a heart of, cheerful heart. God loves a cheerful giver, and what we have the capability of giving. Yeah. God knows what we have. The person sitting next to you in the pew, so think about it, all right? Sarah's 18, and she's at that age where she is now getting credit card offers in the mail. Okay, those will get you in trouble. You can have $500 line of credit right now at what percentage rate? What's going on right now? 20-some%? Either way. So you get $500 and you're paying 20% interest on whatever you spend. You can look good. You can dress nice with that $500, but it's kind of like one of the verses we looked at in the Proverbs that says the borrower is servant to the lender. And so there are people who live in that, I would call it a fantasy of credit card debt to have an outward appearance of wealth. That will get you in trouble. And that's not being a wise steward over what God has entrusted you with. And by the way, that will affect your giving too. Because if you're putting everything on credit, you probably have a pretty low bank account, and you're doing the best to get by in your bank account. You might be withdrawing too much and have an overdraw charge. Well, there's another, $25 overdraw charge, 30, something? It's just constant, exchanging one thing for the other and trying to, as we say sometimes, keep your head above water. When we talk about New Testament giving, there is no such thing as a tithe. Okay? We don't tithe today. We don't give a 10%. Free will, from the heart, cheerfully, not based on what you don't have, but based on what you do. But if we're putting ourselves in scenarios in the world to keep up an image, then our giving a lot of times will probably suffer. Because so far as I know, we don't run credit cards in here during the contribution time, right? Any questions or comments on any of that? No? There we go. You give in secret, and your Father will reward you. I guess that's an interesting discussion because the New Testament says so much about it. And going back to, kind of wrapping up here, going back to Luke chapter 16, if you can't be trusted with the mammon of unrighteousness, if you can't be trusted with a pile of money, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if we set, I tell you one thing that happens is people set such a high standard of living that then they have to work themselves to death to maintain that high standard of living, to keep everything paid. Contribution can go down because I need this, and oftentimes it's an image problem and a heart problem too, because when you look at 1 Corinthians 16, you purpose, you lay by and store as God has prospered him. Okay, I've got the proper perspective that God has prospered me. All right? 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. It's free will. It's chapter 8 and verse 5. I've given myself to the Lord first. I'm dedicated to Him above all things. Chapter 9, verses 6 through, really down through verse 8. I'm a cheerful giver. I don't, what's the word I'm looking for? Dread the opportunity to give. I'm a cheerful giver. There are so many things that can affect that, and we can't allow our standards of living to affect our giving to where we're not giving anything at all, because the Lord's work must go on. And that's something that's taught in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, by the way. Look, and we'll wrap it up here. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 9 and verses 9 and 10, please.
As it is written, He is dispersed abroad, He is given to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now may He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness.
Do you believe that God will bless you? And I'm not saying health and wealth gospel that you give and, man, you're going to get a check in the mail this week from some unknown source and God's miraculously taking care of you. But do you believe that if you give the way you ought to give, that God will bless you? I hope so. So look at what it says there in because all of this is in the context of, back up in verse 8, that you're giving out of a cheerful heart, and God is able to make you abound in that. He gives seed to the sower. He's dispersed abroad. Okay, God will take care of you. And, Paul says the same thing in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 19. God is able to make all this abound to you. And he's talking about the financial contributions that Philippi had made to his work. So, let's wrap it up there, and next week we'll talk about those other very specific things that I was asked about.